Today, we're going to talk about one of the 20th century's most devastating and, for a long time, most hidden tragedies. This is the story of a famine that wasn't an act of nature, it was an act of policy. And that brings us to the central question, the real paradox of this story. Ukraine was known as the breadbasket of Europe for a reason. It's an incredibly fertile land. So how on earth did millions of people starve to death there? It just doesn't seem to make sense.
To start to understand how, we first have to look at the event itself. And, just as importantly, why for so long, most of the world had no idea it was even happening.
The name itself really tells you a lot. Holodomor. It's a Ukrainian word, and it translates literally to death inflicted by starvation. The key word there is inflicted. This wasn't just a bad harvest. This was a man-made famine that took place in Soviet Ukraine, mostly between 1932 and 1933, and it killed millions.
Now, a huge reason this story isn't better known is because the Soviet government that caused it, well, they just flat out denied it ever happened. For decades, any talk about the famine was labeled anti-Soviet propaganda. The people who lived through it were terrorized into silence. It wasn't until the Soviet Union fell in 1991 that the full truth really started to come out.
Okay, so where did this all begin? The seeds of the Holodomor were planted in the brutal ambitions of one man, Joseph Stalin, and his plan for the Soviet Union.
Let's set the stage a little. After the Russian Revolution, Ukraine was forcibly pulled into the brand new Soviet Union in 1922. A few years later, Stalin takes power, and in 1928, he kicks off something called the First Five-Year Plan. It was this all-out push to turn the USSR into an industrial powerhouse fast, and it would have absolutely devastating consequences for farmers. And at the heart of this plan was a policy called collectivization. Now, this was not a gentle suggestion. The government essentially seized millions of private farms from peasants. They took their land, their animals, their equipment, everything. They forced them onto these massive state-run farms, which meant the farmers lost all control over the food they grew. Of course, people resisted. So to crush that resistance, Stalin launched a campaign he called dekulakization. It was a brutal three-step process. First, you identify the most successful independent farmers and label them kulaks. Basically, class enemies. Step 2, you seize everything they own. And Step 3, you arrest them, deport their entire families to Siberia, or in some cases, just execute them. So what they were really doing was systematically wiping out the most experienced and respected farmers in every single village. So with the farmers' resistance broken, the Soviet state now had total control over the food supply. And this is when it turned that control into a weapon, aimed directly at Ukraine. The policies became incredibly specific and cruel. The government set grain quotas for Ukraine that were impossibly high. When villages failed to meet them, they were blacklisted. That meant a total blockade. No food, no supplies, nothing could get in. The borders of Ukraine itself were sealed to stop starving people from trying to escape. They even passed a law that made stealing just a handful of grain from a field a crime punishable by death. And then, teams of party activists would go door to door, ransacking homes and taking literally anything that was edible. And the result of all this? It was an absolute horror. At the peak of the famine, in June of 1933, it's estimated that 28,000 people were dying from starvation every single day. Just try to wrap your head around that number. But here's the thing that is just impossible to ignore. While thousands of Ukrainians were dying every day, the Soviet Union was exporting grain to the rest of the world. Get this, between 1932 and 1933, they sold 1.8 million tons of grain. That's enough food to have fed 5 million people for a whole year. So this wasn't about a shortage of food. It was about a deliberate policy of taking it away. And all of this evidence forces us to ask a really heavy question, one that is still debated today. Was the Holodomor an intentional act of genocide, or was it the tragic but unintended consequence of a disastrous policy? The debate really boils down to two main arguments. On one side, you have the view that this was absolutely deliberate, that Stalin engineered the famine specifically to crush Ukrainian nationalism and any dreams of independence. On the other side, some argued that while it was horrific, it was an unintended disaster, the result of radical, poorly planned policies that spun out of control, made worse by bad harvests. Now, while that academic debate is still going on, politically, a consensus has started to form. Today, a growing number of countries around the world, including the United States and Canada, officially join Ukraine in recognizing the Holodomor as a genocide. You know, the Holodomor isn't just some event buried in the past. Its impact has echoed for generations, leaving this deep scar on Ukraine that helps explain a lot about the country today. Just look at the population numbers. It's stark. Between 1926 and 1939, Ukraine's population grew by just over 6.5%. Now compare that to its neighbors. Belarus grew by almost 12%, and Russia grew by almost 17%. The famine literally carved a hole out of an entire generation of Ukrainians.
And the effects went way beyond just population loss. Villages that were emptied out were resettled by people from other parts of the Soviet Union. The government pushed a policy of Russification to suppress Ukrainian culture and language. An incredible 80% of Ukraine's intellectual class, the writers, artists, and thinkers, was eliminated. All of this created a deep, collective trauma that was passed down through families. And today, the memory of the Holodomor is a fundamental part of modern Ukrainian identity and their long fight for sovereignty.
I want to leave you with this really powerful quote from the scholar Walter Zawitsky. He said, "Why is the Holodomor unique among genocides? Because its last chapter has not yet been written." It's a profound thought. The Holodomor isn't just a closed case from the past. It's a living memory that continues to shape the present and the future, reminding us all how hunger can be used as a weapon and how a nation's memory can forge its will to survive. What does it mean for a story like this to be unfinished? That's something worth thinking about.